Minister Parker is returning from a successful trip to Puerto Vallarta, where he attended the Pacific Alliance Summit as an official associate member. Indeed, New Zealand's relations with Mexico continue to expand through this multilateral effort, along with the CPTPP. Support for multilateral negotiation as a first best option for New Zealand is part of its new Trade for All agenda, which we will hear from its principal promoter today. I would like to thank the Embassy of New Zealand for counting on COMEXI as a platform to engage today's audience in an interesting dialogue. And last but not least, I would like to thank Dr. Luis de la Calle, COMEXI's Vice President, for sharing his outlook and guiding this conversation. Without further ado, I pass the microphone to Luis de la Calle. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Minister. Welcome to Mexico. Welcome to COMEXI. Welcome to the Club Industriales. Very glad to see the New Zealand Ambassador in Mexico, Mark Sinclair. We have also here with us Ambassador Fernando Mateo, former Mexican ambassador to the WTO, and many other friends and members of COMEXI. Minister, COMEXI is the Mexican Council of Foreign Affairs. It's a prestigious institution. I'm privileged to serve as Vice President temporarily on that. And one of the mandates of COMEXI is to make sure that we give our members an opportunity to entertain dialogues with important people like yourself come to Mexico. And then make sure that Mexicans have a better view as to what's happening elsewhere. I mean, Mexicans tend to be navel gazers. We tend to see New Zealand as maybe too far off from Mexican daily life. But international trade has been transforming the country in the last 25 years in a way similar to the transformation that New Zealand went through maybe a bit before Mexico did. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from your experience. And now that international trade is going through a difficult, complex international debate, I think it's for us a tremendous opportunity to have you here and listen from your wisdom. And then we'll have a conversation on the main issues that deal with trade, and then we'll open up the for Q&A with everybody here. For those of you that need translation, there is outside equipment for that. Si requieren traducción a alguna persona, you can pick it up outside. Las preguntas se pueden hacer en español si es más cómodo para algunos de ustedes. So, Minister, why don't you tell us where New Zealand is in terms of trade policy, and so that we can start a conversation.
Gracias, señor. Buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Mi español is malo, so I will speak in English and not torture you. I've got a lot less wisdom than I've got grey hair, but I've got enough grey hair to show you that I've been around for a while in politics, and before that in business. And I'm very happy to talk about the Mexico-New Zealand relationship and to describe the economic journey that we've been through in New Zealand. Until the 1980s, New Zealand was a highly protected economy. We had a very close relationship with what used to be called Mother England, and we were their farm. They then chose to join what was then called the European Economic Community and left us behind. And we had some very difficult choices to make because we were so dependent upon trade with the European Union and, with Great Britain. And because of that privileged position, we had allowed inefficiencies to grow in our economy. And when we were left without that guaranteed market, we were in deep trouble. It also coincided with the oil crises of the 1970s and early 1980s, and so we had rampant inflation, poor economic growth, rising government debt. And we had to take some pretty serious decisions, some of which were a bit uncomfortable at the time. One of the things we chose to do was to open all of our industries to competition. We removed tariffs on virtually everything. The highest rate of tariff in New Zealand is 10% on virtually nothing that we produce. And we've prospered. We've done what economics would say would happen. We've developed our economy in the areas where we had comparative advantage, and as we have become more efficient in those industries, it has spawned other industries on the shoulders of those industries, including technology industries, and that technological capability has in turn spawned technological capability that just springs up in random areas as well. Some examples of that are now integrated into global value chains that include Mexico include Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, and we've got the Mexican CEO of the manufacturing business. Just about all of the consumables for Fisher & Paykel Healthcare worldwide are produced in Mexico. That company produces medical apparatus for people with breathing difficulties, both at home and in hospital situations, and is a world leader in that little niche. Believe it or not, we're the first country in the world that has developed a satellite industry not attached to the military. And we're busy disrupting the satellite launch industry for small satellites. We launch little satellites that are not much bigger than that big, and they're already being launched into orbit now from New Zealand, and within a year they'll be launching about 100 a year. It's a couple a week, at a fraction of the price of satellites that are launched anywhere else in the world. We have developed robotics in our livestock processing. That industry is 50% owned, or that company that's the leader in that, or one of the companies, is 50% owned by a Brazilian company that's invested in New Zealand. That same company produces robotic devices that help for maintenance of long conveyor belts extracting minerals in the Australian minerals industry. So it's products that are developed in New Zealand, half owned by Brazilians, sold into the Australian mining industry, and the investors into the Australian mining industry will be from all around the world. So you can see that that we as Mexico are reliant on the interconnectedness of businesses around the world in order to sustain our standard of living. And in pursuit of that, we're a great defender of the rules-based system. When I say great, I don't mean that we're fantastic. I mean we are strong supporters of the World Trade Organization rules, and we work with like-minded countries to bolster those rules. Like any country, we pursue the things that are important to us, and because a lot of our exports are food-related, it worries us that food-related goods face much higher barriers around the world than manufactured goods. And so we club together with other countries to try and even the playing field there so that that we can have fair rules in trade. We believe that the most important rules lie in the World Trade Organization. And it worries us that the World Trade Organization is under threat. The court, if you like, that polices WTO rules, the appellate body, stops functioning inside a year, or in about a year, because one country in particular is blocking appointments of new judges to the appellate body, and very soon that stops working, and when that stops working, then it'll be easier for people to breach the WTO rules, and we think that is a threat to the prosperity of the world. What do we do in relation to that? Well, we can't control everything within the WTO. We do try to work with like-minded countries like Mexico in respect of those issues, but we also pay more attention to bilateral agreements and regional agreements. Bilateral agreements started to be developed after the UK left us. Great agreement with Australia. We're Australia and New Zealand are amongst the most integrated economies in the world. Works for both of us. We then spread our wings and negotiated bilateral agreements into Asia. Very strong, long-standing trading relationship with Singapore, which led to a negotiation with Chile, which led to a negotiation with Brunei, which was then called P4, which led to CPTPP. So we've had a strategic approach to trade. Notwithstanding that and the importance of trade, we've also suffered a decline in public support for trade in New Zealand, and hopefully that'll come up in question time as to what we've done about that. We've addressed that in a number of ways, which I won't talk about right now. But because of the threats to the trading arrangements in the world, we think that the relative importance of bilateral trade agreements and plurilateral agreements like CPTPP and the Pacific Alliance become relatively more important, and that's why we're putting a lot more effort into those at the moment. We're not alone in that, of course. Most other countries see that that's in their interest also, and that's why there's a lot of progress being made in the likes of CPTPP and the Pacific Alliance. In respect of the Pacific Alliance, we recognise that if it does open itself to new members, and we, along with Australia, Canada and Singapore, in the midst of negotiations now to see whether we can close a high-quality deal, then you can see how that will be an outward force that will be for the benefit of South America as it looks to the Asia-Pacific region as well, in order to improve the fortunes of your citizens. So that's a sort of a brief synopsis of our outlook. Not that brief, sorry about that, but I'm happy to talk about any of these topics.
Well, thank you, Minister. Let me begin by disagreeing with the Minister. I know that New Zealand is a strong defender of the rules-based system. First time I met New Zealand trade negotiators was in 1988 in Kuala Lumpur, in the ministerial APEC meeting that was chaired by Madam Rafida. And Mexico sits between Malaysia and New Zealand in APEC meetings. So I had to my left Loco Smith and Crawford Faulkner. Two very well-known worldwide trade officials from New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand has made a contribution with them and with Tim Grossert and others to workings at WTO and other regional bilateral agreements that is out of proportion to New Zealand's size. And the first thing one discovers when you have the opportunity, the pleasure to work with the New Zealand trade officials is the level of sophistication that you display, the commitment to an open trading system, and the fact that you are very successful in spite of the perception one might have that New Zealand is an isolated country down there, in the Pacific, in the South Pacific. I mean, not too far from the Southern Pole. And in spite of that, you are a tremendous force. And the other thing that is interesting from an outsider is that the trade policy coming out of New Zealand is consistent, even though you have changes in government from different parties. I mean, you've taken a decision maybe 30 some years ago to open up, maybe a decision imposed by the UK quitting or joining the European Union. But I mean, you took a decision to open up the economy and then to become a force for other countries to do likewise.
That's true. In fact, Crawford Faulkner's just been picked up by the United Kingdom as he the lead negotiator? Something like that. So after he retired from the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I think he was he living in Geneva and Paris, was he? What an international life he's led. But he's now working for the UK, and of course we've just kicked off or about to kick off a trade negotiation with the United Kingdom, which is also important to us. We try to be honest to our values in New Zealand. We've got quite a few principles that we hold dear in international relations, not just relating to trade. We're very, very strongly anti-nuclear, and we really push denuclearisation very hard in our dealings with the world and everyone we deal with.
The rainbow boat.
That's right. We had the rainbow. That's right. That's something that we don't bring up too often when we're talking to the French. But yes, we had a boat surprisingly sunk in Auckland Harbour in the 1980s. Their Secret Service wasn't secret enough to escape the country, and they ended up behind bars in New Zealand. But we let them go eventually. But and you know there's something about the New Zealand psyche that likes to stand up for principle, and we suffered some years of being in the wilderness with the United States as a consequence of our stance on nuclear disarmament, but we chose that because we believed it was the right course, and eventually we found a rapprochement with the United States over those issues, and they're an important partner for us now. Similarly, we believe strongly in environmental issues, and we're doing pretty well on forging our way forward to a post-fossil fuel economy in New Zealand. We've got some natural advantages relating to renewable electricity, but most countries do, including your own, actually. We try and align economic outcomes with other outcomes like good environmental outcomes, or the inclusion in New Zealand increasingly of our indigenous people, Maori people, in our trading relationships. We're happy to tell the world that we think that's not a bad idea.
New Zealand is known in Mexico and other places as a producer of kiwis, lamb, milk. Mexico used to be, or maybe we continue to be, New Zealand's #1 client for milk. Powder milk, I think it was. No? Not anymore? But I mean,
still an important market, but not our largest market.
Now we learn from you that you are doing satellites and robotics, and many other things that were unexpected.
And that's born of competitive influences in our economy. I don't think that would have happened if we stayed attached to Mother England.
Yeah, you would continue to be an agricultural-based economy only.
We mightn't have had to work as hard, but we're pretty hard-working people. We're pretty well-educated people. We're not a perfect society. We have our challenges. Like a lot of countries, we've got an increasing concentration of wealth at the top, which I think is one of the reasons why we've had an eroding support for trade, because New Zealanders haven't liked the fact that some of the multinationals don't pay tax in New Zealand, that they felt the winds of change caused by globalisation and digitalisation of the economy. And so we've had to work pretty hard recently to rebuild a public consensus in favour of the trade settings that you say are settled in New Zealand, but they're never settled anywhere, actually, I don't think. I think you have to work at carrying the public with you on those issues. When we took government in about October last year, and CPTPP was on the verge of being completed. When the prior agreement, TPP, which included the United States, was signed, it was signed in Auckland because we were the core that had started it all those years before. And there were protests of between 10 and 20,000 people in the streets, which is a lot for New Zealand, and they blocked the motorway. So we had to reflect as an incoming government on what it was that was causing that disagreement with trade, because it's so obvious that, you know, we need to sell a lot of stuff in the world to buy these in our cars. We don't produce cars, we don't produce computers. A lot of the medicines we use we import, although we do produce some medicines. You know, electronic goods, consumer goods, we produce virtually nothing of them. We actually produce some of the automation lines for the production of whiteware around the world, but we don't produce any whiteware ourselves these days. So why was it that despite that obvious truth that trade's worked pretty well for New Zealand, and we obviously need it going forward, why was there a rising tide of opposition? And we decided that it was essentially caused by the insecurity in the middle class, who were feeling threatened by changing circumstance. We listed a number of things that we were thought were underlay that concern. The disruption to occupations caused by changing technology. The disruption to the mix of what it is that we produce in New Zealand, caused by hundreds of millions of extra people entering world labour markets, and particularly in the Asian region, but also in Mexico. As well as that, you know, multinational tax avoidance, concerns that the benefits of trade were only going to the people at the top. And we unpicked that, and we started to push against multinational tax avoidance by implementing the OECD recommendations against profit shifting and base erosion. We have got a tax review underway looking at whether our own tax system in respect of New Zealanders is fair. We introduced further public support for post-school education, whether it's universities or training, with a view to, over the years, being more generous in tertiary education, so if people lose their job, they can rely upon the state to help retrain them if technology disrupts their job. We pushed against foreign ownership of an asset class in New Zealand. There's a concern, actually quite a lot of places around the Pacific Rim, that foreign buyers outbidding New Zealanders to buy homes in their own land is something that doesn't feel fair. And so we've tightened up on overseas ownership of land, farms and homes. And having done all of those things and a few other things, changing our position in the negotiation on ISDS clauses, investor-state dispute settlement clauses, we reversed our position and now oppose them, relying upon state-to-state enforcement of trade agreements and our own court system to protect people's property rights and contractual rights. Having done that, when we signed up to CPTPP, just 6 months later, you know, the biggest protest was 100 people. Some of that might have been because there was some protectionism on the rise in other parts of the world that made New Zealanders a bit uncomfortable. That helped us, but we really have, I think we have forged a new compact with the people of New Zealand in favour of trade.
Is this something that happened in the campaign or after the campaign? And did you get the position to trade as a political, electoral concern?
Yeah, a bit of both. We set out 5 bottom lines, we called them, that we were going to implement if we were elected in respect of what became CPTPP. They were protecting the single buyer model that we have for the purchase of medicines for our public health system, which has been very successful, and we weren't willing to trade that. We wanted to protect the right of governments to regulate for the environment or public health systems, education systems, labour laws, etc. And in truth, that was already well protected in the agreement, but we were promised that we would never trade that away. We obviously wanted meaningful improvements to market access for our own exporters into other countries. we were going to throw out those ISDS clauses, which we've reversed our position on, and we were partially successful on within CPTPP, not wholly successful, and then we said that we were going to clamp down on foreign buyers of New Zealand land assets.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is another example as to New Zealand leading the way for other economies. I mean, one of the main concerns that we have today in terms of international trade not being very popular in the U.S. and in other developed countries is that the people that favor trade have not made a good case for it. And not only that, I mean, the insistence. The first time I went to USTR with Herminio Blanco, who was my boss, Carla Hills told us, well, we need to work on fact sheets to sell NAFTA, the future NAFTA. This was pre-NAFTA. And the main argument has to be that trade is good because it means exports, and exports means jobs. So when we got out of the meeting, I told my boss, Herminio, it's the other way around. It is imports that are good. Because if you fall into the trap that exports are good because they mean jobs, then opponents will say, well, imports are bad and they mean destruction of jobs. And therefore, you end up evaluating trade agreements with the trade deficit. Well, 30 years later, an unnamed person made exactly that case, that the U.S. is losing because it has a large trade deficit. I mean, how do we begin correcting the misperceptions that people have, not only in New Zealand, but I mean in Mexico, in the U.S., so that we don't end up killing the system that has benefited so many people in the last 30 years?
Well, in my opinion as a politician, the answers don't just lie in trade policy, and you have to unpick the underlying insecurities that are driving that anti-trade sentiment. And if people are worried that they're losing jobs because of robots, don't blame trade for it. Closing your country to trade is not going to fix that problem. Address the problem, which is that people who, through no fault of their own, lose their job because of digitalisation and robots or sensors or bigger machines. You have to do something for them. You've got to help them find their future place in society. So the answer to that issue actually lies in education, retraining, social support for people who lose their job. In respect of technology, don't turn your back on technology. Try and get your share of it. In respect of multinationals paying tax anywhere, fix it. And if you, in my opinion, if you address all those issues, then you can actually have an honest conversation. Most people aren't stupid; they actually know that you've got to sell a bit of kit in order to buy a bit of kit, I don't think many people think that they can avoid the forces of globalisation. Maybe that argument's a bit easier in New Zealand because we're so small and it's so obvious that we're not going to produce a lot of the things that you're able to produce in Mexico efficiently, which we'll never have the scale to produce at home. But I think a lot of these, my own personal view, a lot of these insecurities relate to inequality. So
yeah, I mean, I think inequality is maybe the main force behind, but also in my way of thinking, the 2009 financial crisis and the cost that it had, and migration. Is migration a concern in your part of the world? And do you have views on that?
I'm careful. Well, actually, we're a pretty tolerant country in New Zealand. We have amongst the highest rate of migration in the world. it's pretty controlled. It's because we've got such big sea borders. We don't have a lot of uninvited migration. We try to separate the debate about refugees from economic migration. We're going through a period when we are increasing the number of refugees we take because there's such a big problem in the world. And we don't take as many refugees per capita as some other countries do, and we've decided we should take some more in New Zealand. But we separate that debate from economic migration, which we try to shape so that it's in the economic interests of our country. And we do that through a points-based system that tries to encourage well-educated migrants that add to the productivity of our economy. We have some business migration as well, not a lot, some. So but we've been pretty successful of integrating a number of communities. Our indigenous Maori population is very successful relative to a lot of indigenous minorities, but still less successful than they ought to be. And so we are trying to address that in a number of ways, outside of trade and inside trade. We, as a country, we were one of the last countries that was colonised in the world by European forms of colonisation. The original indigenous Maori people had arrived about 1,000 years earlier, but New Zealand wasn't settled until the 1800s by European settlers. And I won't go into the detail of it, but there was a treaty. It was quite a benign colonisation. There was a treaty between the indigenous people and the British Queen Victoria, which was partly honoured, partly breached. Since there's been a reconciliation addressing some of those breaches, which has settled more assets upon the indigenous population, and they've been hugely successful at growing their asset base and are now embarking upon trading relationships and really keen to partner with indigenous populations in other countries for their mutual benefit. So we're, in our Trade for All agenda, one of the things we're trying to do is not just push the benefits of trade down to smaller businesses, to women, but also to indigenous groups, in this effort to prove to people that trade is for all, not just for wealthy people.
And I understand you have some successful cases, I mean, in terms of Maoris exporting agricultural products and other type of things.
Not just that, you know, our geothermal, we've got 85% electricity in New Zealand's now renewables. It's mainly hydro, but virtually no new hydro these days. All the new capacity comes from a mixture of wind power and geothermal. A lot of the geothermal resources have been sitting under indigenously owned land, Maori land, and they've been developed in partnership with the indigenous owners of that land, who themselves have developed capacity and now are owners of companies that are active in Mexico to try and help Mexico develop its geothermal resources, which is a great renewable baseload electricity source.
Let me review your trade policy, if we might, from 4 different levels. I mean, unilateral things you might do, bilateral, regional, and then multilateral initiatives you might be undertaking. Do you have any plans to unilaterally do more things in New Zealand? I mean, a good chunk of your opening has been, if I understand correctly, unilateral. Do you have more in store?
There's virtually nothing left to do. We had a discussion. The only thing we could do is drop the remaining tariffs that we've got on footwear and clothing, which is 10%, which my trade officials reminded me as I came into this meeting. And we've got virtually no clothing or shoe manufacturer in New Zealand, and unlikely to have it unless it becomes automated. There's not much we could do unilaterally more. We're open to the forces of competition, and we try to thrive. I don't want to give a Pollyanna, fantasy view of New Zealand. We're not without our challenges. You know, we have our indigenous population is overrepresented in our prisons, and their educational attainment is not as good as it is for some other populations. And we need to do better on those fronts. But they feel solvable problems rather than hopeless problems. We have a current account deficit because we're not very good savers. We spend too much money. But
it's not a result of your trade policy, is it?
No, it's not. No. And, government debt before we did this was 80% of GDP. Net debt's now about, I think, 22% of GDP. We're in surplus. We've got good social supports. We've got a fantastic public health system, really good public education system. Just about everyone in New Zealand sends their kids to public schools because they're good enough. We've got a strong environmental ethic. So can I just turn to the environment a little?
Sure. Because
it's a really strongly held view in New Zealand. We don't think we should have to sacrifice the environment for the economy. In fact, I love that quote from Herman Daly, who was a World Bank economist, said, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And it's true. It is true. And it's absolutely clear in a country like New Zealand. It's true everywhere. And, some of these environmental problems that we've got, like climate change, this terrible pollution, plastic in the oceans, resource depletion, these are the loss of biodiversity around the world. These are terribly significant problems that no one country can overcome, and it's a terrible shame that the environmental agreements that we have around the world don't seem to often include enforceable mechanisms that lead to the rate of progress that most of us, I think, in this room would hope for. But trade agreements can help. We can't rely upon trade agreements to do all of the heavy lifting in the environment, but they can help. And so we try to have provisions in our trade agreements which align environmental outcomes. Like it's atrocious that some countries of the world still subsidise plundering of fisheries illegally in other parts of the world. Well, trade agreements can stop that. We've got provisions in CPTPP that Mexico and New Zealand have both supported that ban subsidies of illegal, unreported fishing. Well, as a country, New Zealand, our lead negotiator now is another fantastic guy, Vangelis Vitalis. 20 years ago, when he was a younger man, he took the first resolution into the WTO to ban subsidies on illegal fishing through the WTO. 20 years later, it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we edge ever closer to it in the WTO, but we still haven't got there. But we have got there into CPTPP, and maybe one day other regional agreements will include provisions like that, and if we do, you'll actually be bolstering support not just for a better world, but for support for trade, because your citizens will think, my God, that's a good thing. We don't like to see the world's fisheries being depleted, because we want fish to be in the sea as well as on our plate occasionally. We like trade agreements, so we've got to we think that trade agreements can be a force for good in the world.
Extremely important issue, how to deal with environment, trade, and there's a growing support for finding a way to do that. Now, bilaterally, you have a large neighbor next to you, so do we. Are there any lessons from the things you do with Australia, or things you might do later on with them?
We let them beat us in cricket. It's very good for but then we thrash them in rugby.
All Black is one of your main experts.
Well, we don't.
Are you working on improving your agreement with Australia? Why don't you tell us whether you have, for instance, dumping cases between the two of you, or antitrust? No. How do you do antitrust with?
No.
What lessons that we can draw from what you do there?
We've got very similar institutions ourselves. We have increasing alignment between institutions. At one stage, there was even talk about having a common currency, but luckily we didn't make that mistake. As perhaps Italy finds or Greece finds relative to Germany these days.
Australia is a commodity-based economy for minerals, and that has an impact on their exchange rate.
True. That's true. Yeah, we wouldn't want to be tied to an exchange rate that went up and down by mineral prices when we're not a mineral-rich country. We work hard at it. We have meetings between the Prime Minister and ministers every year in either Australia or New Zealand. We've got a Trans-Tasman Business Council that also works hard. Our departmental officials would look to each other's country whenever we have a policy problem. We would look first to Australia, and I think they would look to New Zealand as well as further afield when we're dealing with regulatory issues. We have very, some things like minimum energy performance standards for appliances, which are really important. It's the cheapest way to stop greenhouse gas emissions is to not waste electricity. And so we develop efficiency standards with Australia. In fact, they do most of the work, and we get the advantage of that on that occasion. We work together in international fora on trade issues or just about any other issues, human rights issues. We're very, very close to the Australians, and of course we've been military allies of them in wars. We've never been military foes. So we have a relationship. Of course in some ways they're the dominant one in the relationship because they're so much bigger. But that's fine by us. They're bigger than us. But yeah, there's most of the time there's mutual respect.
How do you deal with migration with Australia?
There's complete freedom of movement.
Complete freedom of movement.
Yeah. But that's relatively easy because we're close to being the same economically. There's not a big wage differential. There is a wage differential between New Zealand and Australia, just a bit narrower than it used to be. You go back 30 years and New Zealand wages were, or 40 years, they were higher than in Australia. Now Australian wages are higher than us. We've been reasonably successful in recent decades. They've been more successful. They've got very good work-based savings. If there was one thing that's been different other than their natural endowment of resources, it would be their deeper capital markets born of work-based savings. They've got a very, very good scheme, one of the best in the world actually. We haven't got that in New Zealand.
Now, in terms of regional agreements, let's begin with CPTPP. What are the prospects for entry into force for that agreement? Mexico has already approved it. Japan has done it, I think, in the lower house.
No, Japan's finished. Mexico first. Japan were a couple of weeks behind. Singapore has also bought their documents about a week ago. We'll be finished before the end of the year, probably around October.
So that's 4. We need 6. Right?
We need 6 for it to come into effect the end of the year or start of next year. CPTPP will be in force, we expect.
Do you have any expectation that the U.S. might one day change its views and knock the door, say we might reconsider that we're quitting?
Possibly, we don't know. For that to happen would require the agreement of the other parties. The other parties would be open to it on conditions. There would be some things that the United States would be hard-pressed to renegotiate back into the agreement that are suspended provisions. A lot of the countries feel very strongly that they need affordable medicines for their public health systems, and I've heard other countries other than New Zealand express the view that we're not too keen on extensions to some of those areas. But the US remains the largest economy in the world, and they're a very prosperous economy, and they're a valued partner with us. So, I don't see Mexico closing the door to them, nor New Zealand.
You just came from Puerto Vallarta earlier today, and for a Pacific Alliance meeting. Some people wonder why a country that belongs to TPP soon and would like to join the Pacific Alliance at all. Colombia is not that important, is it?
Colombia is an important country. But not a large trading partner of New Zealand's. We think that all of these regional agreements are actually important to bolstering the world rules-based order. Every country there's really only two superpowers in the world economically, China and the US. The EU as a bloc is, of course, of huge collective economic power, but slightly different given that it's a group of countries rather than an individual country. And all of the other countries in the world are at risk if we return to a system that has only bilateral relationships. All of the countries in the world, other than perhaps 2 or 3 superpowers. And all of those countries obviously include New Zealand, but they also include much larger economies like Mexico. So I think the reason that it's wise that the Pacific Alliance wants to spread its influence in the world is that it increases the power of that bloc to support fair trade rules for themselves and for others, because all of these things to work actually have to be reciprocal, and we all know that if they are reciprocal, we all benefit. It's it really is. There is mutual advantage in these things. Now we've already got 2, or is it 3 agreements with Chile? 3. P4 and CPTPP and the bilateral. So we've got 3 arrangements already with Chile.
2 Pacific Alliance.
No, CPTPP. 3 with Singapore, 2 with Chile. I'm not sure that we're going to agree on this, but anyway, I can't count properly. But we've already got a number of agreements with Singapore and Chile, and they actually all work together. They don't. There's no great complexity caused by these additional layers, and they all work to bolster the rules-based system. And it's good that other countries want to join Alianza Pacifico. It's good that other countries want to join CPTPP. It's good that bilateral agreements are spreading. The European Union, all those years after the UK left us, we are at long last in a negotiation with the European Union. We think that's about time, to be honest, because they're a like-minded country in a lot of ways. But they now see the benefit of a range of bilateral agreements as well, because they can see that the rules-based order is under threat. The final thing I'll say on that is this is not all about trade. It's about the environment. It's about fisheries. It's about peace. One of our trade officials recently wrote an article about the Pacific Charter, and it was really penned for internal use and was shared with someone. All of a sudden it appeared on the WTO website, and it's probably still there. The Pacific Charter was signed by Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt in 1941. Sorry, what did I say? Atlantic. Did I call it the Pacific Charter? Sorry, the Atlantic Charter. Thank you. I agree on that. Thank you, Mark. That's right. He's a very good ambassador. But yeah, so the Atlantic Charter was signed in 1941 between Churchill and Roosevelt. They're at sea, really dangerous for both of them to get there. And in 1941, their Pacific Charter and Atlantic Charter, and about the 3rd paragraph down, said that the future world order would include open trading relationships. And why did they do that? Because they knew that World War II had been caused by the aftermath of World War I, which included very, very closed trading relationships used to the detriment of some countries who had a great sense of injustice as a consequence. And they knew that the future world order, for that to be peaceful, there had to be fair trading of resources and trade amongst countries. And it remains true today. Trade is a force for peace as well as for economic prosperity.
Yeah, and actually I think the meeting in Vallarta, in terms of Mexico, sends three signals. I mean, one is that Mexico will have a trade policy that is relatively open, regardless of who is governing Mexico. I mean, the presence of people from the transition government in Vallarta sends that signal. Second signal is that the world will go ahead with a trade agenda, even if the U.S. is in a pause, not participating. I mean, I don't want to make the case that the America First might lead to America Alone. But I mean, the fact that we are, that New Zealand, Singapore, Canada, and Australia came to the Pacific Alliance sends a signal that the world is willing to work on these issues, even if there is no U.S. leadership in the short term. The fact that Japan signed an agreement with the EU last week sends the same signal. And then the other one that is important for Mexico is that the Pacific Alliance has become very influential now in Latin America. And the fact that the Mercosur countries were also in Vallarta is a true change. Because the Mercosur countries, they were part of the Cairns group that New Zealand led for many years. And they wanted opening in agriculture, but they tend to have a relative protectionist policies elsewhere. And you never know. I mean, the fact that Mercosur is now talking to the Pacific Alliance might lead to something more interesting in Latin America.
Well, I'm less qualified to comment on that than you. We observe that from afar. But that example I gave earlier of what I think is one of New Zealand's best technology companies, one of the most advanced robotic companies in the world, not for regular repetitive robotics, but irregular robotics that have to do different movements and use scanners to decide the next movement, a lot of sensors and things. It's half Brazilian owned. We have, we've got those examples of relationships in Mexico already. I can see the importance of closer trading relationships within South America and more broadly. We can't avoid globalization.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then we'll open up to our questions from the audience. How do we fix WTO? It's a simple question. Do we need to strengthen the dispute resolution system so that we can deal with Chinese violations in a more efficient manner? Should we listen to President Trump's complaint that MFN duties in the U.S. are lower than the European Union and others, and that is unfair, that countries are taking advantage of the U.S.? Should we engage in zero duty for industrial goods among G7 and maybe other coalition of the willing, like-minded countries? New Zealand has been a defender of the rules-based trade system.
Well, dealing with your intermediate point there's no different principle between manufactured goods and other goods. So you won't find us defending high tariffs on food-related products and low tariffs on manufactured goods. A job's a job, a sale is a sale. An integrated product and distribution system is, they're comparable. I agree
100%.
Yeah. So without naming countries, we accept some of the complaints that are made by the US. We would note that average levels of protection in the US aren't that different from some of the other countries that they complain about, but they're both higher than the levels of protection that we are. So we'll stand on our high ground on that one. It's difficult to know whether the protestations about the appellate body can be made specific enough to address, or whether there is an ambition just to get rid of the appellate body. And we don't know the answer to that. I'd like to know the answer to that. We're open to ideas to improve the WTO. We're not as negative as some people about the WTO. It's only a couple of years ago that progress was made at Nairobi. So we ought not to catastrophise, but we ought to be worried, and we ought to recognise the importance of it. And because of those threats, and because they're real, we also need to pay more attention to these plurilateral agreements that are a second best but nonetheless important. But going back to the WTO things, what can you do to improve it? Well, it's hard, isn't it? If you move away from consensus, who do you trust to decide for you? The WTO has, in order to make progress, relied upon the power of the United States to push through consensus, and we hope that they will return to using their power for good in the WTO.
All right, why don't we open the floor for questions. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Right here in the front, Agustin Berros Gomez. If you can identify yourselves and be brief.
I'm Agustin Berros Gomez. I'm a former congressman of this district here in Mexico City. I currently have a television program as well as a real estate investment company. Briefly, just to the point with respect to principles, we haven't defended trade on principles, and we have to move from the free trade to the freedom to trade, to see it as a basic freedom, to reject the idea that our government can tell you what you can and cannot buy based on the fact that it's illegal good. I think that's very important. It's something that we haven't done. But more specific to New Zealand, soon the Cook Islands will become a new developed country, right? It will be officially a developed country, and it is an associated state of New Zealand. And so I'd like to talk about distance. I mean, if Luis believes that New Zealand is far away, the Cook Islands literally are in the middle of absolute nowhere. And yet, it is in the process of officially being defined as a developed country, and this is in part because of its association with New Zealand. So how is geography not destiny?
Well, dealing with your first, can I agree with you on your first point about the freedom to trade? I like that language, and it actually reminds me of that book by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, Development is Freedom, effectively saying that one of the basic human rights that people have is to develop their own economic potential, and that's one of the reasons why he's so down on overly regulated economies that prevent people from embarking upon ventures because they're not allowed. Now, that's not to say you don't need regulation. You do need regulation for safety and environment, etc. But I actually like that, the freedom to trade, or fair trade. But I'm going to steal that phrase because I really like it. The point that you ask about distance from markets. Well, necessity is the mother of invention, is a saying in New Zealand. How was it that we came to develop expertise in these little electric motors that are so efficient to drive refrigeration? Maybe that's because we're distant from market and we've had to learn how to control the temperature of the things that we produce so that they don't spoil before they get to market. We're really good at that. We're really distant from market, but we don't spoil much food, even though we sell it on the other side of the world. So, that's from disadvantage comes capability sometimes. Your point about them being going to be classified as a developed country, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know that, even though they're on our doorstep and we're closely associated. It raises the point that there are a lot of some other countries that hide behind the developing categorisation in order to avoid responsibilities that they ought to be taking in the world as developed countries.
Well, the U.S. is now asking for a special and differential treatment.
Well, I have some sympathy for them in their criticism of countries that are truly developed countries but still claim the moniker of developing country. We have a new trade agreement in the Pacific. It is more permissive of protectionist measures to protect developing interests in those small island states than any other trade agreement that we have, because we recognise that some of the difficulties born of isolation and the tiny markets that they are mean that in some areas they do need to have more protection than you would need in New Zealand or Mexico. They're a well-managed country. They're free from corruption. They've got a strong tourist industry, and they have a safety valve in terms of freedom of movement of people to New Zealand.
Carlos Camacho.
Thank you very much. My name is Carlos Camacho. I'm a member of the board of Comexi. First of all, we are honored for your presence here. And I have two sets of questions. The first one is a little bit personal. How you manage yourself to be Minister of Trade and Export Growth, Attorney General, Minister of Economic Development, Minister of the Environment, and Associated Minister of Finance, all together at the same time, and you have time to come to Mexico. That's the first part. The second one is more related to your past experience as a businessman and related to your Ministry of Environment, which is agricultural biotechnology. How do you see the development of agricultural biotechnology in New Zealand, as well as the related trade of products produced by biotechnology? And are you worried about agricultural biotechnology being handled by very few companies all over the world?
Dealing with your first question, I used to be Minister of Energy and Climate Change. I used to be an environmental lawyer before I went into business, and so I have some unfinished business in New Zealand on water quality. And we face a challenge in New Zealand in the quality of water in our rivers, having been degraded by the intensity of some of our pasture-based livestock systems, which is one of the reasons why Mexico needs not be worried about a huge increase in volume of dairy products, because we have an environmental constraint on the increasing the number of cows, essentially. So that's essentially why I've got that environment portfolio, because I believe strongly that we can align these things, and I love our rivers and our cleanliness of our environment, and I'm determined to do my bit to protect them. In terms of your second question about biotechnology, I was involved with a very successful New Zealand farmer, quite a young man actually. In fact, tragically, he died by age 50, but he was a completely self-made man, hadn't inherited any money, and he became the wealthiest man in the South Island of New Zealand. And he became interested in some of the technology that was developed out of the New Zealand farm industries. We as a country underinvest in research and development. As government, we're trying to improve that through some incentives. But the one exception to our underinvestment in research and development is in the agricultural sector, where as a country we have probably invested the highest proportion of GDP in science relating to agriculture of any country in the world for 100 years, consistently. And out of that has flowed a lot of efficiencies and science and farm systems and environmental systems and a lot of related technologies. Some of those, because of the new areas of understanding opened up by improved understanding of genetics and computing power, have unleashed new understandings. In New Zealand, virtually none of them are genetically modified. We don't have an absolute prohibition on genetically modified organisms, but we have a precautionary approach, and no genetically modified crop or animal has yet been released for general use in New Zealand. There are some people who criticise that we're too conservative, but as a country we're pretty comfortable with that setting. So the biotechnology change or related industries that we have in New Zealand are non-genetically modified. And one that I was involved in was a company that called A2 Corporation, which has discovered what it believes is a health difference between different variants of the beta-casein protein that is found in milk. The theory being that some variants of that protein have adverse effects for human health, others don't. And so by screening the cows to see what genome they have and which controls which form of the protein is expressed in the milk that's produced by the cow, you can produce a higher value milk which is free of the beta-casein A1 protein, which is called A2, beta-casein A2 milk, and that's proven to be a very successful company, and indeed has probably been one of our highest, volume to value stories in New Zealand. Sadly, I sold all of my shares for a very low price when I became a Member of Parliament, because I believed personally in the underlying health issue, and therefore I felt I had a conflict of interest to hold shares in it. But we are on a journey from volume to value. We haven't been especially successful at that as a country, but you can see the ship turning, because it takes a while, and I think we've got a reasonably positive future.
Well, we have time for one more question. Ambassador De Matteo.
Fernando De Matteo. Well, Luis already put the question I want to put to you about how to fix WTO. But I do believe that there are a number of elements that you have to fix WTO. Now, to start with, you mentioned it, is the dispute settlement mechanism, particularly the appellate body. There are certain elements that really need to be fixed, but you also have to fix subsidies. You also have to fix agriculture. Today there was a tweet, I believe, $12 billion in subsidies to U.S. producers. I mean, double jeopardy now, because they've been hurted because of the measures put by other countries to the U.S. And well, there is a number of elements there, a number of groupings. The so-called friends of the system. There's a more secret one that's called the old school friends of the system: New Zealand, Australia, and the Pacific Alliance, and Costa Rica. So my question to you would be, what could those members do to try to keep going the WTO? Because, I mean, the way it looks is that WTO may die of inanition. Do you say that in English?
Well, I hope it doesn't. Your comments about the WTO appellate body, we're up for changing what is imperfect, but you've got to have a list that you can address, and so we need to try and elicit specificity as to the things that are needed to be fixed. In terms of Friends of the System, various countries are trying to organise meetings to come together to discuss ways in which it could be improved. We try and work with a range of countries. You'll find us at WTO meetings backing complaints by African countries in respective measures that prevent them fairly trading cotton. We haven't got an interest in it, but we believe they're right. So we'll back them. Countries that are countries need to come together. But it may be that if the worst happens in respect of the WTO, the best response lies in building out the Pacific Alliance and CPTPP and those regional alliances, because then the cost to the countries that are not in those agreements becomes higher. They are, CPTPP is it's got a lot of good text in it. There's a lot of good principles in there. One of the things that we like in it is that one of the legitimate concerns is where you have state subsidised enterprises competing overseas. We don't do that in New Zealand. It's not fair. If a company's got free capital from the state and various subsidies or regulatory advantages, then they ought not to be able to take those advantages to unfairly compete overseas. CPTPP has controls on that. So there's some good things that can be done there. Those agreements like CPTPP have provisions on electronic commerce. Sorry, I'm rattling on too much.
So competitive liberalization is part of the answer to the WTO. Yep. We have to go because the minister has to go. But so sorry about that. One of the unexpected outcomes of the trade opening in Mexico and also in New Zealand was the growth of the wine industry.
Yes.
Yeah. Mexico, when Fernando and I were negotiating the Mexico's EU agreement, Mexican wine producers would tell us, listen, we're going to be devastated. And now Mexico has a growing, healthy, much better, higher prices, much better quality wine industry, and so does New Zealand. You produce one of the best wines in the world, and some of the more pricey ones. So we hope that in the small cocktail that we'll be offering now, we'll get to taste either Mexican or New Zealand wine.
Well, I when I got to Puerto Vallarta a couple of days ago, we made sure that we bought a nice bottle of Mexican red wine for dinner, and it was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, let's give a hand to the minister for this presentation.